Mud sucked at Hester's boots, eager to pull her down into the rot of the riverbank. Autumn had arrived in the valley, not with a crisp breeze, but with a week of punishing freezing rain that turned the Blackwater River into a swollen, bruised artery. She knelt by the edge, ignoring the damp seeping through the knees of her wool skirt. Her fingers were already numb, scraping at the rough bark of a white willow tree. The apothecary paid 2 pennies a basket for the bark, barely enough for a loaf of dense rye and a handful of coal, but starvation was a highly effective motivator. Wind howled down the river gorge, carrying the distinct metallic smell of crushed pine needles and wet stones. Hester paused, wiping a strand of dirty blonde hair from her cheek, leaving a streak of grey silt behind. Then she heard it. It wasn't a scream. A scream would have been carried away by the roar of the rapids. It was a sharp, high-pitched gasp, followed by the sickening splash of something heavy breaking the water's surface. Hester dropped her basket. She scrambled up the embankment, slipping on the decaying leaves, her chest tightening. Downstream, where the river narrowed and churned white over jagged limestone teeth, a patch of vivid, unnatural cobalt blue bobbed in the violent grey foam. A coat. A child. Panic, cold and sharp as glass, pierced her stomach. "Don't do it," a cynical voice hissed in her head. "The water is freezing. The current will snap your neck against the rocks. You are 24 years old, unmarried, and you will die for a stranger." She hesitated. For 3 agonizing seconds, she stood on the bank, watching the blue patch vanish under a swell, then fight its way back to the surface. The child wasn't crying anymore. The river was swallowing him. "Damn it!" She rasped the words, tearing at her dry throat. She didn't dive gracefully. There was no heroism in her movements. She half slid, half fell down the muddy bank, plunging into the Blackwater. The cold was an absolute physical violence. It punched the breath from her lungs instantly. It wasn't water. It was 1,000 icy needles driving into her flesh, paralyzing her muscles. For a terrifying second, her heart seized. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She forced her arms to move her heavy wool skirts, ballooning around her like a lead weight, threatening to drag her straight to the bottom. She kicked tasting silt and dead fish. The current grabbed her hips, spinning her. Water rushed into her nose, burning her sinuses. She thrashed wildly, aiming for the flash of blue. Her knuckles scraped against a submerged rock, tearing the skin, but the freezing water immediately numbed the pain. "Where is he?" Something brushed her calf. She plunged her arm down blindly into the murky, freezing depths. Her fingers snagged on heavy, waterlogged fabric. She closed her fist, her joints screaming, and pulled with everything she had left. A small body broke the surface. A boy. His skin was the color of skim milk, his lips a terrifying bruised purple. His eyes were rolled back. Hester gasped for air, swallowing a mouthful of the foul river. "Wake up!" she screamed at him, though he couldn't hear her. She hooked her left arm under his chin, keeping his face above the churning surface, and used her right arm to fight the current. Her muscles burned with a lactic acid fire. The bank was only 20 feet away, but it felt like miles. Every stroke was a negotiation with death. The river tugged at her, a jealous entity refusing to give up its prize. She kicked until her thighs cramped into tight, agonizing knots. Her boot caught on a submerged root. She pushed off it, launching them both toward the shallow edge. Her knees hit the gravel. The pain was grounding. She dragged him out, crawling on all fours, her breath coming in ragged, ugly sobs. They collapsed onto the muddy weeds. Hester rolled onto her side and violently vomited river water and bile into the dirt. Her entire body convulsed with violent, uncontrollable shivers. Her teeth chattered so hard she tasted copper from her bitten tongue. She wiped her mouth with a trembling, muddy hand and forced herself to look at the boy. He lay perfectly still. He was small, perhaps 5 or 6. The cobalt blue coat wasn't just wool. It was velvet lined with ruined silver brocade. A heavy silver clasp at his throat dug into his pale skin. He looked like a drowned doll. "No, no, no," Hester muttered, crawling over to him. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp, ripping it off. She pressed her ear to his chest. Under the smell of wet dog and river sludge, there was a faint, erratic thump. She rolled him onto his side and struck him hard on the back, right between the shoulder blades. Nothing. She hit him again harder, wincing at the violence of it. "Breathe, you little fool!" The boy jerked. A horrific wet rattle tore from his throat. He vomited a torrent of muddy water over the rocks, his small frame heaving violently. He gasped, sucking in the freezing air, his eyes flying open. They were wide, terrified, and a startling shade of stormy grey. He didn't cry. He just stared at her, his jaw trembling violently, his hands clutching weakly at the mud. Hester slumped back on her heels, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush, replaced by an exhaustion so profound she thought she might pass out. She looked at her ruined skirts, her bleeding knuckles, and then at the shivering, impossibly rich child. "Well," she chattered, pulling her sodden knees to her chest. "This is a magnificent disaster. Getting the boy onto her back took 3 humiliating attempts. He was a dead weight of soaked velvet and terror. He felt like a sack of wet grain, his small arms locked around her neck in a stranglehold that she barely had the energy to loosen. "Not so tight," she rasped, her throat raw. "I need my windpipe. Need." He didn't answer. He just buried his freezing face into the curve of her neck, his shallow, ragged breaths puffing against her skin. He smelled of river rot and expensive lavender soap. The contradiction made her stomach turn. The walk up the valley ridge was an exercise in pure, monotonous agony. The wind had picked up, slicing through her wet clothes. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her shins. Her boots squelched heavy with water and mud. She had no idea who he was, but there was only one estate within 5 miles that dressed its children in silver brocaded velvet on a Tuesday afternoon. Highfield, the Westford estate. It was a sprawling monster of grey stone and wrought iron that sat on the hill like a vulture watching the village below. Hester had never been past the outer gates. The people up there didn't buy willow bark from apothecaries. They imported doctors from London. Why was he by the river? She thought bitterly, shifting his weight. Her lower back screamed in protest. Where were the nurses? The tutors? They have a dozen servants just to wipe the silver, but they let a child wander into the black water. Are we dead? The voice was so quiet she almost missed it over the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. It was a raspy, aristocratic little voice. No. Hester grunted, keeping her eyes on the rutted dirt road. Though I reserve the right to change my mind if we don't find a fire soon. It's dark. It's just the clouds, she said, though the afternoon sun had indeed abandoned them, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. What is your name? Leo. Well, Leo, you are very heavy. He tightened his grip slightly. I'm sorry. She sighed, a puff of white vapour escaping her blue lips. The raw, miserable apology in his voice chipped away at her cynicism. He was just a child, a freezing, terrified child. Don't apologise for gravity. Just hold on. It took nearly an hour to reach the perimeter of the estate. By the time the massive wrought iron gates of Highfield loomed out of the fog, Hester couldn't feel her feet. Her vision was tunnelling grey static buzzing at the edges. She stopped, leaning heavily against the cold stone pillar of the entrance. Through the bars, the manor house blazed with light. A dozen lanterns illuminated the immaculate crushed gravel driveway. It looked like a different world, warm, golden, and untouchable. A shadow detached itself from the gatehouse. A guard, wrapped in a thick wool cape, holding a lantern up to the iron bars. He took one look at Hester, a drenched, mud-caked woman looking like something dredged from a nightmare, and his hand went to the heavy wooden truncheon at his belt. Off with you! The guard barked, his voice muffled by the wind. No vagrants on Westford land. The village almshouse is back the way you came. Hester didn't have the energy for outrage. She leaned closer to the bars, the iron biting into her frozen cheek. I am not a vagrant. She managed her jaw stiff. I have something that belongs to the house. The guard sneered, stepping closer, the yellow light of his lantern washing over her. We don't buy stolen scraps here, beggar. Turn around before I set the dogs. He stopped. The lantern light caught the patch of cobalt velvet draped over Hester's shoulder. It caught the silver brocade. And then it caught Leo's pale, shivering face as the boy lifted his head from Hester's neck. The guard's face drained of colour. The lantern shook in his hand. Lord Leopold, he whispered, his voice cracking. Panic exploded on the other side of the gate. The guard dropped the lantern. It shattered on the gravel oil, flaming up for a brief second before dying in the damp. He fumbled frantically with a ring of massive iron keys, cursing, dropping them, picking them up again. Open the gate, Hester said flatly. She was too tired to savour his terror. Before he freezes to death on your watch. The iron gates shrieked as they swung open. The guard didn't even look at Hester. His eyes were fixed on the boy. He reached out his thick hands, hovering awkwardly. Let me take him. Give him here. No. Leo whimpered, his fingers digging painfully into Hester's collarbone. He pressed himself harder against her wet chest. Hester shifted away from the guard's grasping hands. He stays with me. Lead the way, and tell someone to boil water. The walk up the gravel drive felt longer than the miles from the river. Estate workers were pouring out of the side doors, a chaotic swarm of lanterns and panicked voices. Footmen in pristine livery stared in horror at the muddy trail Hester was leaving on the immaculate stones. Someone was screaming orders. A woman in a starched white apron burst into tears at the sight of the boy. Hester ignored all of it. She put one foot in front of the other, her breathing ragged, her eyes fixed on the massive oak doors of the manor. She didn't feel like a saviour. She felt like a carcass being dragged to the butcher. She reached the top of the marble steps and crossed the threshold. The heat of the foyer hit her like a physical blow. It was suffocatingly warm, smelling of beeswax, dried lavender, and burning oak. She stood in the centre of the entrance hall, water pouring off her skirt, pooling in dark, muddy puddles on an impossibly intricate Persian rug. She stared down at the ruined silk fibres, a hysterical bubble of laughter rising in her chest. I am definitely going to be billed for this rug. Where is he? A voice thundered from the upper landing. The chaos in the foyer instantly died. The frantic whispering of the servants vanished, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Hester looked up. He descended the sweeping marble staircase not with a rush, but with a terrifying, controlled violence. The Duke of Westford. Roland. Hester had seen him once years ago riding through the village on a horse that cost more than her entire neighbourhood. She remembered a profile cut from granite and an air of absolute indifferent authority. The man coming down the stairs now was different. He was impeccably dressed in a dark charcoal waistcoat and a stark white cravat, but the pristine edges of his wealth were frayed. His dark hair was slightly dishevelled, as if he had been running his hands through it. His jaw was locked so tight a muscle jumped near his ear. But it was his eyes that caught her off guard. They were the exact same stormy, turbulent grey as the boy's, and right now they were manic. He didn't look at the ruined rug. He didn't look at the puddle of river mud creeping toward the polished wainscoting. He didn't look at Hester. His gaze was entirely obsessively locked on the lump of wet velvet clinging to her back. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The space between them felt highly combustible. The servants had practically pressed themselves into the walls, trying to erase their own existence. Leo, the Duke said. His voice was low, rough, as sandpaper, entirely devoid of the booming authority he had used a moment ago. The boy flinched. He slowly turned his head, untucking his face from Hester's neck. Father. Roland exhaled. It was a jagged, ugly sound. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the cold, untouchable Duke cracked, revealing a vast hollow terror beneath. He closed his eyes, his broad chest, rising and falling once sharply. When he opened them again, the mask was back, bolted firmly into place. He stepped toward them, his boots echoing sharply on the marble. He stopped mere inches from Hester. Up close, he was massive, blocking out the light from the chandelier. He smelled of clean linen, expensive brandy, and the sharp metallic tang of pure adrenaline. He reached out to take the child. Hester, operating purely on exhaustion and animal instinct, took a half step back. "He's freezing!" She croaked, her teeth beginning to chatter violently again, now that the walking had stopped. He needs a hot bath. Slowly. Not boiling. You'll shock his heart." Roland's eyes finally snapped to her face. It was an intensely uncomfortable physical sensation being looked at by him. It felt like being assessed by a predatory bird. His gaze swept over her plastered, muddy hair, her blue, trembling lips, the bleeding, raw knuckles of the hands currently keeping his air from hitting the floor, and finally, the dark, foul-smelling river water dripping from her skirt. Disgust relief and a deep, simmering anger warred in his expression. The anger won. "Give him to me," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the tone of a man who owned the earth beneath her feet. Hester's jaw tightened. The absolute arrogance of it sparked a hot flash of irritation in her freezing chest. She wasn't one of his scullery maids. She had just pulled half the black water out of her lungs to save his bloodline. "Gladly," she muttered. She unclasped her stiff, aching fingers. As she let go, Leo let out a distressed noise, but Roland caught him instantly. The Duke's large hands enveloped the boy, pulling the soaked, filthy child against his pristine white linen shirt, without a second's hesitation. He held the boy, tightly burying his face briefly in Leo's wet hair. Hester stood there, suddenly empty-handed, swaying slightly. Without the boy's weight to ground her, the room began to spin. The heat of the fire was making her dizzy, confusing her body temperature. Roland turned to an older, severe-looking woman in black silk who had materialized at the base of the stairs. "Mrs. Higgins, draw the bath. Fetch Dr. Aris. If he is not here in 10 minutes, tell him I will burn his clinic to the ground." "Yes, Your Grace," the housekeeper whispered, vanishing instantly. Roland turned back to Hester. The boy was safely in his arms, shivering against his chest. The Duke's immediate panic had subsided, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He looked at Hester, not as a savior, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Where did you find him?" The question was sharp, an interrogation. "The Blackwater." Hester said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around her own ribs, trying to stop the tremors. "Down by the limestone bend." Roland's eyes narrowed. "He was in the river." "No, Your Grace, he was taking a lovely stroll on the bottom of it." She snapped, the sarcasm slipping out before she could bite it back. A collective gasp echoed from the servants against the walls. Roland didn't yell. He didn't blink. He just stared at her, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The silence stretched heavy and dangerous. "You forget yourself, woman. I'm freezing to death, actually," Hester said flatly, a cynical, exhausted smile touching the corner of her blue lips. "My apologies if my etiquette washed away in the current. Your son was drowning. I pulled him out. I walked him here. If you are finished barking at me, I would like to go home before I catch pneumonia." She turned on her heel, aiming for the massive oak doors she had just entered through. Her legs felt like hollow reeds. She took one step too. "Stop." The command hit her back like a physical hand. She paused, closing her eyes, a wave of profound dizziness washing over her. "You are soaked through." Roland's voice came from behind her. The anger was still there, but it was edged with something else now. Reluctance. "It is 5 miles to the village. You will not make it past the gates." "I walked 5 miles with him on my back," she muttered, not turning around. "I can manage without. You are shaking so hard you can barely stand." The heavy, measured footsteps approached her. "I do not owe debts, and I will not have it said that the Duke of Westford allowed the woman who saved his son to die in a ditch on his property." Hester swayed. The floorboards seemed to tilt upward. She tried to take another step toward the door, but her knees simply gave out. The adrenaline had finally vanished, leaving nothing but the brutal, icy wreckage of her own body. She braced for the impact of the marble floor, but it never came. A heavy, warm hand clamped around her upper arm, the grip iron tight. He hauled her upright effortlessly. She gasped, her head snapping back to look at him. He was holding Leo in one arm and supporting her entirely with the other. Up close, the intensity in his grey eyes was suffocating. "You are staying." Roland stated his voice, a low, immovable vibration in the quiet hall. He looked past her to the terrified footman. "Prepare a guest chamber, the one near the fires. Have the maids bring dry clothes. Now." Hester wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him to go to hell to take his manner and his arrogance and shove it. But the darkness crowding the edges of her vision finally closed in. "Fine." She slurred the word thick and heavy. Her head dropped forward, resting against the wet velvet of Leo's coat, right against the Duke's arm. And the world went beautifully, silently black. Consciousness trickled back, slowly tasting of copper and bitter herbs. First came the heat. It was dry, aggressive, radiating from a massive hearth and baking her skin until it felt paper thin. Next was the oppressive softness underneath her. It swallowed her limbs, a mattress stuffed with goose down that offered no resistance, making her feel as though she were floating in a suffocating cloud. Hester peeled her eyes open. The light was violently bright, slicing through the dull, rhythmic pounding in her skull. She wasn't in her cramped, drafty room above the cobbler's shop. Above her stretched a canopy of heavy crimson damask, embroidered with gold thread that caught the firelight. The walls were panelled in rich, dark mahogany, absorbing the glow of a dozen beeswax candles. The air smelled of camphor, burning oak, and the faint, dusty scent of dried roses. It was a beautiful room. It made her stomach turn. She tried to push herself up. A sharp, searing pain instantly laced through her ribs, forcing a pathetic, wet gasp from her raw throat. Her limbs felt like they were cast in lead. "I would strongly advise against moving, miss." The voice was clipped, starched, and utterly devoid of warmth. Hester turned her head, the movement sending a fresh wave of dizziness crashing over her. Sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by the fire was the housekeeper from the foyer, Mrs. Higgins. She sat perfectly rigid, a piece of white linen embroidery resting untouched in her lap. Her black dress was so severe it seemed to swallow the light around her. "My clothes," Hester rasped. Her voice sounded demonic, a dry, grating scrape against her vocal cords. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a voluminous, blindingly white nightgown made of imported Egyptian cotton. It felt like a ghost's shroud. "Burned," Mrs. Higgins said flatly. She didn't look up from the fire. "They were soaked in river filth and entirely unsalvageable. The doctor said you were suffering from acute hypothermia. Your core temperature was perilously low. We had to remove the wet garments immediately." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Hester's chest. Her clothes, her boots, the boots she had spent 3 months saving for, the coarse wool skirt that was her only defense against the winter. Gone. Erased by people who didn't understand the catastrophe of replacing a 6-shilling garment. "You burned my boots," she asked, her voice cracking. "They were ruined," Mrs. Higgins replied, finally turning her head. Her eyes were hard, assessing Hester with thinly veiled disdain. "The Duke has already instructed that you be provided with a new wardrobe. You are a guest of Highfield until Dr. Aris deems you fit to walk." "I don't want a new wardrobe. I want to leave." Hester gritted her teeth, ignoring the screaming protest of her muscles, and threw the heavy silk duvet off her legs. The cold air of the room hit her bare calves. Her legs were covered in ugly purple-black bruises and violent red scrapes where the river rocks had battered her. Her knuckles, resting against the crisp white sheets, were raw meat, bandaged tightly with white gauze. "You will fall before you reach the door," Mrs. Higgins stated, unmoving. "And I have no intention of picking you up off the floor a second time." Hester swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. The floor was covered in a thick Persian rug, soft against her bare toes. She gripped the heavy mahogany bedpost, taking a shallow, painful breath. "Just stand up," she ordered herself. "You are not a charity case. You are a loose end in a rich man's house." She pushed off the mattress. For a fraction of a second she was standing. Then the room violently tilted on its axis. Black static swarmed her vision. Her knees dissolved into water and she collapsed. She didn't hit the floor. Two strong, calloused hands caught her by the upper arms, hauling her upright with startling efficiency. A sharp smell of carbolic soap and stale tobacco filled her nose. "Mrs. Higgins is entirely correct, my dear," a gruff voice said near her ear. Though she lacks a certain bedside manner, Hester blinked away the darkness. An older man with a bristling grey moustache and wire-rimmed spectacles was holding her up. Dr. Aris. He smelled like a walking apothecary. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply lifted her under the knees and deposited her back onto the suffocatingly soft mattress, pulling the duvet over her legs with practiced authority. "You have 2 broken ribs," the doctor muttered, pressing 2 cold fingers against the pulse point on her wrist. "A severe contusion on your left hip. Lacerations on your hands and calves. And you inhaled a significant amount of the black water, which is essentially a liquid graveyard. Your lungs are inflamed. If you try to walk to the village today, you will be dead by sunset." Hester stared at the ceiling, a heavy, suffocating exhaustion pinning her down. She hated the certainty in his voice. She hated that he was right. "The boy." She whispered the question, forcing its way past her resentment. "Lord Leopold is young, and he has a constitution forged by expensive meat and clean air," Dr. Aris said, dropping her wrist. "He has a mild fever, but he will recover. You, however, are severely malnourished. Your body had nothing to burn to keep you warm in that water. You survived on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. And now the bill has come due." He picked up a small dark glass vial from the bedside table. "Drink this. It contains laudanum. It will pull you under, stop the shivering, and keep you from doing something foolish like trying to stand again." "I don't want it," Hester muttered, turning her face into the pillow. She needed her wits. The drug would turn her brain into sludge. It was not a request. A new voice cut through the room. Low, immovable, dangerous. Hester turned her head. Roland, the Duke of Westford, stood in the doorway. He had changed clothes since the foyer. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored black coat and dark trousers, but the sheer size of him made the large doorway seem suddenly cramped. Mrs. Higgins instantly stood dipping into a deep, silent curtsy, before vanishing past the Duke, like a shadow. Dr. Aris cleared his throat, setting the vial on the table. "Your Grace," the doctor said. "The fever is taking hold. She needs rest." "Then ensure she gets it," Roland commanded, his eyes locked on Hester. "Leave us." Dr. Aris nodded quickly, grabbing his leather bag, and practically fleeing the room. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Hester lay trapped under the silk covers, staring at the most powerful man in the county. She felt stripped bare raw and utterly vulnerable, and she hated him for it. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the crackle of the logs in the hearth. Roland did not move from the door immediately. He watched her with an intensity that made Hester's skin prickle. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her bandaged hands. The dark bruises creeping up her neck, the bruised, exhausted circles under her eyes. He was cataloguing the damage his son's life had cost. Finally, he stepped into the room. He moved with a heavy, predatory grace, the floorboards entirely silent beneath his boots. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his large hands resting on the carved mahogany footboard. "Dr. Aris informs me you are attempting to leave," Roland said. His voice was neutral, entirely stripped of the manic edge it had held in the foyer. It was the voice of a man accustomed to negotiating treaties and commanding armies. "I have work," Hester rasped, gripping the edge of the silk duvet. "I collect bark. I sell it. If I don't work, I don't eat. I cannot afford to lie in a silk bed for a week." Roland's jaw tightened. A flash of irritation crossed his stormy grey eyes. "You are speaking as if I intend to throw you back into the gutter with empty pockets." He reached inside his coat and withdrew a heavy dark leather pouch. The distinct metallic clinking of coins echoed in the quiet room. He tossed it onto the mattress. It landed near Hester's knee with a dull, heavy thud. 50 guineas, Roland stated. It is more than enough to replace your ruined clothing, cover your lost wages, and secure lodgings far superior to whatever drafty hovel you currently inhabit. Hester stared at the leather pouch. 50 guineas. It was an astronomical sum. It was more money than she could earn in 5 years of scraping willow bark in the freezing rain. It was a lifeline. It meant food, coal, real boots. It meant survival. But looking at the pouch sitting there on the immaculate white sheets, she felt a sudden violent surge of nausea. It was too easy for him. He was standing there pristine and untouched, buying his way out of an emotional debt. He was turning the horrific, agonizing negotiation with death she had experienced in the river into a simple financial transaction. A service rendered. A fee paid. She looked up from the gold and met his gaze. Her chest heaved, the broken ribs screaming in protest, but she ignored the pain. "Is this the going rate for a duke's heir?" she asked. Her voice was weak, but the venom in it was potent. 50 guineas, I would have thought the bloodline was worth at least 100. Roland froze. His hands clamped down on the wooden footboard so hard his knuckles turned white. The sheer unadulterated insolence of her words seemed to physically strike him. The carefully constructed mask of the aloof aristocrat cracked, revealing the raw, volatile anger beneath. "Do not mistake my generosity for weakness," he said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a rough, dangerous edge. "You saved my son. For that, I am compensating you. Do not test my patience with your bitterness. I am not bitter, Your Grace." Hester fired back a cynical smile, touching her cracked lips. "I am simply amazed. You have 100 servants. You own half the county. You have iron gates and guards with truncheons. Yet your 5-year-old son was walking on the bottom of the black water completely alone." The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Roland exhaled sharply, a ragged sound that tore from his throat. He stepped around the footboard, closing the distance between them, until he was standing directly beside the bed looming over her. The smell of cold rain and expensive leather radiated from him. "You know nothing of my house. You know nothing of my son," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of barely contained fury. "You pulled him from the water. You did not earn the right to judge my failures." The word hung in the air. Failures. It was an admission, raw and bloody, slipping past his defenses before he could stop it. Hester looked up into his face. Up close, she saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. She saw the absolute soul-crushing terror that he was trying so desperately to bury under anger and gold. He wasn't just arrogant. He was drowning in his own guilt. The anger drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, heavy fatigue. She reached out with a trembling, bandaged hand and picked up the heavy leather pouch. The gold clinked inside. It felt dirty, but she was not a fool. Pride did not buy bread. "I'll take your money, Your Grace," she said softly, dropping the pouch onto the bedside table next to the laudanum. It landed with a heavy, final sound. "But don't pretend this makes us even. You didn't pay me for saving him. You paid me so you wouldn't have to look at me and remember that you weren't there." Roland stared at her. For a long, terrible moment, he didn't move. He looked as though he wanted to strangle her, or perhaps collapse. The muscles in his throat worked as he swallowed heavily. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply turned his back on her, his broad shoulders rigid, and walked out of the room. He didn't look back as he closed the door, leaving her alone with the gold, the fever, and the oppressive heat of the fire. Midnight arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence. The manor was too quiet. In Hester's village, the night was a living, breathing entity. Dogs barked at shadows, drunks argued in the muddy alleyways. The wind constantly rattled poorly fitted window frames. The noise was a comfort. It meant the world was still alive. Here, the stone walls were so thick they smothered the world outside. The silence rang in her ears, amplifying the throbbing pain in her ribs and the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. The laudanum Dr. Aris had forced upon her had worn off hours ago, leaving behind a sticky, foul-tasting residue in her mouth and a lingering mental fog. She lay flat on her back, staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling, listening to her own shallow, ragged breathing. Then a sound. It was faint. A soft, hesitant scraping against the heavy mahogany door. Hester turned her head, wincing as her neck muscles pulled taut. She watched the brass handle of the door slowly, agonizingly turn. The latch clicked. The heavy door groaned open just a fraction, revealing a sliver of the dark, unlit hallway beyond. Nothing happened for a long minute. "I don't have a weapon, but I am extraordinarily cranky," Hester rasped into the darkness. The sliver of darkness widened. A small shadow slipped through the gap, freezing instantly as the firelight hit it. Leo. He was drowning in a white cotton nightshirt that reached his ankles. His feet were bare against the thick carpet. The dark, wet curls that had plastered his head hours ago were now a mess of dry, unruly waves. He stood by the door, clutching a small, worn velvet rabbit to his chest, his knuckles white. He looked terrifyingly small. The massive room seemed to threaten to swallow him whole. Hester pushed herself up onto her elbows, biting the inside of her cheek to ground herself against the sharp flare of pain in her chest. "Shouldn't you be asleep?" Leo didn't answer. He stared at her, his large, stormy grey eyes wide and unblinking. He looked like a wild animal deciding whether to bolt or attack. Slowly, carefully, he took a step forward, then another. He moved with a strange, unnatural silence, bypassing the chairs and the heavy wardrobe drawn inexorably toward the bed. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Hester could see the faint tremor in his small shoulders. He wasn't crying. There were no tears. But the look on his face was a profound, haunted emptiness that did not belong on a child. "Are you dying?" he whispered. His voice was raw, scratching against the silence. The bluntness of the question caught her off guard. She let out a short, breathy laugh that ended in a painful cough. "No, I'm just extremely annoyed with my ribs at the moment." Leo took another step closer, his eyes dropping to her bandaged knuckles resting on the white sheet. "You bled." "Rocks are sharp," Hester said simply. She didn't know how to talk to children. She had no younger siblings. The urchins in the village were feral creatures she mostly avoided. She certainly didn't know how to talk to a traumatized aristocratic heir. "It's just skin. It grows back." Leo chewed on his bottom lip. He looked toward the blazing fire, then back to Hester. He shuffled his bare feet, the thick carpet muffling the sound. He looked utterly lost adrift in his own massive house. "The water was loud," he said, suddenly the words rushing out of him in a desperate exhale. "It was so loud. And it was dark. I couldn't see the bottom." Hester felt a tight, agonizing squeeze in her chest that had nothing to do with broken bones. She remembered the panic, the absolute freezing violence of the river. He had been in there longer than she had. She slowly reached out, resting her bandaged hand palm up on the edge of the mattress. She didn't beckon him. She just offered the space. Leo stared at her hand for a long time. Then, with a sudden jerky movement, he closed the distance. He didn't climb into the bed. He simply dropped to his knees on the rug and pressed his forehead against the side of the mattress right next to Hester's hip. He buried his face in the silk duvet, his small hands clutching the worn velvet rabbit so tightly his fingers shook. He still didn't cry. He just needed an anchor. He needed someone who knew exactly what the dark water felt like. Hester awkwardly moved her arm, letting her bandaged hand rest lightly on his messy curls. He was warm. His fever had broken. She kept her hand there, feeling the rapid bird-like thrumming of his pulse at his temple. They stayed like that in the silence, a muddy, cynical apothecary and a broken little lord, bound together by the rot of the Blackwater. Neither of them heard the door open wider. Hester looked up. Roland stood in the doorway. He was no longer wearing his coat. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, his cravat loose, and hanging around his neck. He looked ragged. The cold, impenetrable Duke was entirely gone, replaced by a man hollowed out by fear. His eyes locked onto the sight before him, his son kneeling on the floor, clinging to the bed of the woman he had tried to pay off. Roland took a step into the room, his hand reaching out instinctively. Leo. The boy flinched violently at the sound of his father's voice. He didn't look up, but he pressed his face harder into the mattress, his small shoulders bunching up defensively. He shrank away from the voice. Roland froze. The hand he had extended dropped slowly to his side. The look of pure, unadulterated devastation that washed over his face was almost too intimate to witness. It was the look of a man realizing that his money, his title, and his power were absolutely useless in the face of his child's terror. He couldn't comfort his own son. The boy sought safety with a stranger instead. Hester felt a sudden, unexpected pang of pity for the arrogant man in the doorway. The anger she had felt earlier vanished, replaced by a heavy, sad understanding. They were both trapped in this room, damaged and bleeding in their own ways. She kept her hand resting gently on Leo's head. She looked at Roland, her eyes softening just a fraction. "Close the door." "Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sarcasm. "He hates the drafts." Roland stared at her, an ocean of unspoken failure swirling in his stormy grey eyes. He looked at her hand on his son's head. Slowly he nodded once. He stepped fully into the room, pushing the heavy mahogany door until it clicked shut, sealing the three of them inside the suffocating heat of the chamber. Coals popped in the grate, spitting tiny orange sparks against the blackened iron. The sharp percussive sound was the only thing anchoring the room to reality. Roland did not move toward the bed. He sank into the high-backed velvet chair Mrs. Higgins had vacated hours earlier, moving with the heavy, uncoordinated slump of a man whose bones had turned to lead. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. The firelight caught the silver signet ring on his right hand, a heavy, brutal piece of metal that looked entirely out of place against the exhausted droop of his shoulders. Hester kept her hand on Leo's head. The boy's breathing had finally evened out, deepening into the heavy rhythmic pull of true sleep. His fingers had gone slack around the velvet rabbit. He was still kneeling on the floor, his face mashed into the mattress silk, but the terrible vibrating tension had left his small frame. "My throat is sand," Hester rasped, breaking the suffocating silence. Roland's head snapped up. He blinked, disoriented, staring at her as if he had forgotten she was capable of speech. Then his eyes dropped to the crystal pitcher of water sitting on the bedside table, entirely out of her reach. He stood. He didn't summon a servant. He walked over to the table, the heavy floorboards silent beneath his boots, and picked up the pitcher. The sharp, clear sound of water hitting the crystal glass cut through the heavy air. He held the glass out to her. Hester tried to push herself up on her left elbow to take it, but her broken ribs screamed a violent objection. A sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped her clenched teeth, and she collapsed back onto the pillows, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Roland didn't hesitate. He set the glass down, leaned over the bed, and slid his large hand behind her shoulders. His touch was shocking. After the freezing violence of the river and the oppressive dry heat of the fire, the firm, grounded warmth of his palm against her back was startlingly real. He smelled of rain-soaked wool, expensive tobacco, and sweat. He hoisted her upward with terrifying ease, moving her as carefully as if she were made of spun sugar, until she was propped against the carved mahogany headboard. He picked up the glass again and held it to her lips. Hester hated the indignity of it, but her body demanded the water. She drank greedily, the cool liquid sliding down her raw throat like a balm. When she pulled back, coughing weakly, a drop of water escaped her lips and ran down her chin. Roland reached into his pocket, pulled out a pristine, white linen handkerchief, and with a strange clinical detachment, wiped the drop away. His knuckles brushed the dark purple bruise blossoming along her jawline. He stared at the mark for a long second, a muscle feathering in his cheek. "His governess," Roland said suddenly. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape in the quiet room. He stepped back, putting distance between them, and stared down at his sleeping son. "Miss Gable. She was highly recommended by the Duke of Somerset. Impeccable references." Hester said nothing. She let her head rest against the wood, waiting. "Leo dropped a porcelain inkwell in the library this morning." Roland continued, his eyes fixed on the boy's messy curls. It shattered, ruined a rather expensive Persian rug. Miss Gable believes in rigorous discipline. She locked him in the unused scullery closet. She intended to leave him there until supper. A cold, sharp disgust twisted in Hester's stomach. He is 5. He found a loose latch on the coal chute, Roland said, ignoring her. He was speaking to the room, to the fire, to the crushing weight of his own guilt. He climbed out. He was trying to walk to the village, to find the woman who used to nurse him before she was dismissed for stealing silver. He thought she would hide him. And instead he found the black water. Hester finished quietly. Roland finally looked at her. The arrogance that had defined him in the foyer was utterly eradicated. I was in a meeting with my estate managers. I did not even know he was missing until the footman brought the ruined inkwell to my study. He swallowed heavily, the sound loud in the silence. I employ 80 people in this house. 80. And my son had to seek refuge with a half-drowned stranger. He looked at the heavy leather pouch of gold sitting untouched on the bedside table. A bitter, self-deprecating smile touched the corner of his mouth. You were right. I was not paying you for his life. I was paying you to absolve my own negligence. Hester looked at the broken man standing in the opulent, stifling room. She was supposed to hate him. He was the embodiment of everything that kept her starving. But looking at the raw, bleeding guilt in his eyes, she couldn't find the energy for resentment. Take the boy, your grace. Hester said, her voice softer than it had been since she arrived. My arm is going numb and the floor is ruining his knees. Roland moved instantly. He bent down and scooped Leo into his arms. The boy whimpered slightly at the disturbance, but as soon as he registered the familiar smell of his father's coat, he buried his face in Roland's neck, his small hands twisting in the fabric of the Duke's lapel. Roland closed his eyes, his massive hand cupping the back of the boy's head, holding him with a desperate, suffocating tightness. Sleep, Miss Hester, Roland whispered, turning toward the door. No one will disturb you. Morning light proved significantly less forgiving than the glow of the hearth. It stabbed through the crack in the heavy crimson drapes, illuminating a room that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully upholstered cage. Hester woke with a groan, every nerve ending in her body, singing a chorus of agonizing, bruised misery. Her ribs felt as though a carriage had parked on her chest. Her scraped calves stung against the friction of the fine silk sheets. She lay there for 20 minutes, cataloguing the damage before the desperate need to empty her bladder forced her to move. She swung her legs out of bed. The dizziness was still there, lurking at the edges of her vision, but it was manageable. The laudanum hangover made her mouth taste like rusted iron. Draped over the velvet chair where Roland had sat was a dress. It was not her coarse wool skirt. It was a simple, impeccably tailored day dress of dark green merino wool. It smelled faintly of lavender and new cloth. Next to it sat a pair of sturdy, soft leather boots polished to a mirror shine. Hester stared at the garments. The sheer cost of the leather alone could feed her for a month. Dressing was a humiliating, agonizing battle. Getting her arms above her head to pull the dress down over her bruised shoulders brought tears of sheer frustration to her eyes. She refused to ring the bell pull for Mrs. Higgins. She would rather suffocate in the wool than let that severe judging woman see her struggle. By the time she had managed the buttons and wrestled her swollen feet into the buttery leather boots, she was sweating through the fine fabric. She needed to breathe. The smell of camphor and burning oak was making her nauseous. The manor was terrifyingly quiet as she slipped out of the guest chamber. She navigated the sweeping carpeted hallways purely by instinct, following the faint scent of fresh air and wet earth. A startled footman carrying a silver tray of teacups flattened himself against the wainscoting as she passed, but she ignored him. She pushed through a heavy side door and stumbled out into the morning. The air was brutal, crisp, and wonderfully sharp. The rain had stopped leaving behind a pale, bruised sky and a world dripping with cold moisture. Hester stood on the stone terrace, closing her eyes and taking a deep, painful breath of the clean air. To her left, the massive stone structure of the estate's stables loomed, smelling strongly of wet hay horse sweat and oiled leather. It was a grounded, honest smell. She walked toward it, her new boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The stable doors were wide open. Inside it was warm and dim, filled with the rhythmic sound of horses shifting in their stalls and the low, coarse voices of stable hands. And there was Roland. He was not wearing his tailored coat or his pristine cravat. He wore a heavy canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and smeared with dark grease. He was holding a heavy iron rasp, working on the hoof of a massive pitch-black gelding. Hester stopped in the shadows of the doorway watching him. He moved with a brutal, focused efficiency. There was no hesitation, no aristocratic aloofness. He was wrestling a ton of muscle and bone into submission with pure physical force. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, mixing with dirt and horsehair. He looked entirely different. He looked human. The gelding snorted, stamping its other heavy hoof against the straw. Roland murmured something low and rough, running his large, calloused hand firmly down the beast's flank to steady it. "He favors the left side," Hester observed, her voice raspy. Roland froze. He didn't drop the hoof immediately. He finished filing the rough edge of the keratin, lowered the horse's leg gently to the ground, and then turned. He looked at her standing in the doorway in the dark green wool dress that fit her perfectly. His stormy grey eyes swept over her, taking in her pale face, the dark smudges under her eyes, and the rigid, painful way she held her shoulders to protect her ribs. He wiped his dirty hands on a rag pulled from his pocket. "You should be in bed. Dr. Aris explicitly forbade walking. Dr. Aris is a pompous idiot who prescribes laudanum for bruised pride." Hester shot back, stepping into the stables. The smell of the horse was comforting. "And I cannot afford to lose another day. The apothecary will give my contract to Old Man Miller if I don't deliver my quota." Roland threw the dirty rag onto a nearby hay bale. The sudden movement made the black gelding toss its head. "I gave you 50 guineas. You could buy the apothecary's entire shop and burn it to the ground if you so desired." Hester reached into the pocket of the green wool dress. She pulled out the heavy leather pouch. It clinked heavily as she tossed it onto the wooden rim of the horse's stall. "My skirt was worth 4 shillings. Hester said, her voice flat and utterly devoid of intimidation. "My boots were 3. The basket of bark I dropped in your cursed river would have fetched 2 pennies. Keep your guilt money." "Your Grace, I'm not a whore and I'm not a priest. I don't sell comfort and I don't sell absolution." Roland stared at the pouch of gold sitting on the wood. The muscles in his jaw locked so tight, Hester thought his teeth might crack. He took a step toward her, the smell of leather and sweat rolling off him. "You are the most infuriating, stubborn creature I have ever had the misfortune to encounter," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And you are an arrogant coward who thinks a handful of gold can fix the fact that his son would rather drown than live in his house." Hester fired back, her pulse hammering against her bruised ribs. They stood inches apart, the air between them crackling with a furious, ugly tension. It wasn't romantic. It was the violent friction of 2 people who had seen the absolute worst of each other and refused to look away. Roland's chest heaved. He looked down at her defiant pale face, at the dark bruises blooming on her jaw, at the sheer desperate pride radiating from her trembling frame. Slowly the anger drained from his face, leaving behind that same hollow, crushing exhaustion she had seen the night before. "I know," he whispered. The admission was raw, stripped of all defenses. He reached out his dirty, calloused fingers, stopping mere millimeters from the bruise on her cheek. He didn't touch her. He just let his hand hover there, a silent apology. "I know." Leaving Highfield felt less like an escape and more like an amputation. By noon, the damp chill had seeped back into the valley, coating the estate in a thick, miserable fog. Hester stood in the gravel driveway, the heavy green wool cloak Mrs. Higgins had practically shoved into her arms, wrapped tightly around her aching shoulders. A carriage was waiting. It wasn't the Duke's massive, ostentatious, crest-bearing vehicle, but a sturdy, unmarked black cab with a single, massive grey draft horse. "This is entirely unnecessary," Hester muttered, wincing as she shifted her weight. "I walked here. I can walk back." If you attempt to walk 5 miles with 2 broken ribs, you will collapse in the mud, and I will be forced to send a search party to scrape you off the road, Roland stated. He was standing beside the open carriage door, back in his pristine dark coat, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. The physical vulnerability of the stables had vanished, replaced by the rigid posture of the Duke. But his eyes were different. The coldness was gone, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable awareness. Before Hester could argue, the massive oak doors of the manor creaked open. Leo stood on the top step. He was dressed in a simple dark blue sailor suit, his dark curls brushed flat against his forehead. He didn't run. He walked down the marble steps, with a slow, deliberate solemnity, his small boots clicking against the stone. He stopped in front of Hester, looking up at her with those massive, stormy grey eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of white willow bark. It was dirty. It smelled faintly of river mud. He must have sent a servant down to the bank to find it. Hester stared at the piece of wood. A tight, painful lump formed in her throat, thick and suffocating. She slowly lowered herself, ignoring the agonizing sharp stab of pain in her chest, until she was eye level with the boy. She took the piece of bark from his small hand. Her bandaged knuckles brushed his pale skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Leo stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a sudden desperate movement, he threw his small arms around her neck. He buried his face in the rough wool of her cloak, holding on with the same terrifying, crushing grip he had used in the river. Hester closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around his small, trembling back. She smelled the expensive lavender soap, but underneath it, there was just the scent of a frightened child. She held him tightly, her own eyes burning with hot, unshed tears. "Don't go back in the water, little lord," she murmured into his hair. "I won't," he whispered back, his voice muffled by her cloak. He pulled away abruptly, his cheeks flushed, and stepped backward, retreating to stand directly beside his father. Roland did not look down. He simply moved his large hand to rest firmly, groundingly on his son's small shoulder. Leo didn't flinch. He leaned slightly into the heavy weight of his father's hand. It was a microscopic shift, a tiny fracture in the suffocating isolation of the estate. But it was there. Hester stood up, biting her lip against the pain in her ribs. She looked at the Duke, and then at the leather pouch sitting on the velvet seat inside the carriage. She had left it in the stable. He had put it back. "I told you." Hester started pointing a bandaged finger at the gold. "And I am telling you," Roland interrupted, his voice low and immovable, "that the apothecary in the village is a cheat who underpays you. The Westford estate goes through a considerable amount of willow bark for the horses. You will deliver your weekly quota directly to my stable master. He will pay you triple the village rate. It is a business arrangement, nothing more." Hester stared at him. It was a lie. It was a blatant, transparent lie disguised as commerce. He was buying her time, buying her safety, ensuring she wouldn't freeze to death looking for scraps on the riverbank. He was tying her to the estate. She looked at the harsh, uncompromising lines of his face, at the exhaustion that still lingered in his eyes, and at the solid, protective way his hand gripped his son's shoulder. She didn't throw the gold back at him. She didn't spit a cynical remark. She simply pulled the hood of the green wool cloak over her head. "I expect payment upon delivery, your grace," she said softly, stepping up into the dark carriage. "I don't offer credit." A faint, incredibly rare ghost of a smile touched the corner of Roland's mouth. It changed his entire face, making him look startlingly young and dangerously human. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Hester," he said. He closed the heavy carriage door himself. The latch clicked with a heavy, final sound. He tapped the side of the wood twice, and the driver snapped the reins. The carriage lurched forward, the iron wheels crunching loudly over the gravel. Hester sank back into the plush velvet seat, the sharp pain in her ribs pulsing in time with the sway of the cab. She held the dirty, mud-stained piece of willow bark tightly in her bandaged hand. She watched out the small glass window as the fog swallowed the sprawling, oppressive grey stone of Highfield. The Duke and his son stood on the driveway until they were nothing but blurred shadows anchored to the gravel, watching her disappear. She was bruised, exhausted, and carrying 50 guineas of dirty money. The mud of the Blackwater was still under her fingernails. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were no sweeping promises of salvation, no sudden declarations of love. But as the carriage turned onto the muddy, rutted road leading back to the village, Hester realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the river. She had finally learned how to pull someone else out.